Alright, so now that we have those item subclasses really nailed down and we have one for consumables that we made last time, we need to be able to use those. And I figured in order to start using those, maybe we can put them into a hotbar of some kind, because a lot of games will have something like that. So that's what we're going to be constructing here today. So let's start out by making a new widget blueprint, and we'll call that something like widget blueprint hotbar, because it'll be the hotbar. And I'm just going to put this in a canvas panel because it's going to be like up at all times anyway. We're not going to be instancing this a bunch of different times, so it's fine to use a canvas panel here. Anything that gets instanced a lot, you probably don't want to have that happen. Okay, this is going to be slightly weird for a moment, but we're going to be adding a button. And this button is more or less just going to be a way for us to detect when we enter and leave this with our mouse cursor. We're not going to be adding any on-clicking events or whatever to it. We just need this for hovering events. So we'll come over here to the background color and we'll actually set the alpha to 0. So the button itself is going to be invisible. We just use it for its functionality. And then we'll add a item grid. We made this in the inventory series itself, in the first parts, in the first segments, the first chapter, whatever you want to call it. And we can just add one of those to this button. And we'll make this fill up the entire thing. And we'll just make sure that this scales properly with the screen itself. Now, we need to assign inventory slots to this item grid, because that's what item grids do. They show the contents of an inventory. So let's go make that inventory real quick. And if we go into the third person character here, into the blueprint for it, we already have an inventory component on this, you might think. So what are we going to do? Well, actually, it's pretty easy. We're going to add another one. So we add another inventory component here, and we'll call this one the BP hotbar inventory components, something like that. Here we'll say the inventory size will be 5. Let's actually do maybe 6. Then while we're in here anyway, let's go up here to event begin play. And at the very end here, what we'll do is we'll get the BP hot inventory component. I apparently didn't type hotbar. And we can construct that inventory. So inventory construct, just like we do with the normal inventory component. And then we will create a widget, and we're going to be creating the hotbar widget, and we'll immediately add that to the viewport, because the hotbar is always going to be on the viewport, more or less. If you want to be able to disable the hotbar, you can of course just save it out as a variable, but for the most part, you're probably not going to need to do that. So now if we start up the game, we will see that we have the hotbar existing in here. It's still empty, but we'll work on that in a moment. The reason it's still empty is that this item grid doesn't have a inventory component assigned to it. So the way we do that is much like we have in the past, is adding a inventory component, and that'll be of type inventory component. Who would have guessed? And this one we will make instance editable, of course, and then we will expose spawn. So now if we go back into the third person character, we right click the create hotbar widget. We can refresh this node, and we now have this inventory component input, and that's where we can put in the hotbar inventory. And once we've done that, if we are back in the hotbar widget blueprint, we can get our item grid, and we can set the inventory components on the item grid. We can do this on event pre-construct if we want to even. So pull in the inventory components, put that in there, and there we go. And much like we do in other inventory screens, what we'll actually do is we will grab the item grid here as well. And then on event construct, we want to update the item grid right away, just so that once it has the inventory component assigned to it, it will actually like render out the inventory slots itself. And with that, we can now see we have the hotbar. Obviously, it's a little bit like too wide at the moment. And there's a few different things that we could do to fix that. What we could do is we could go into the item grid, and then in the rep box, we can set the horizontal alignment to being centered. And that way, when things get added, they get added to the center, which looks a little bit neater. But the issue with that is that then if we open the inventory itself, it'll also start adding them in the center here, which by and large, probably not that big an issue. but it could be slightly annoying and not exactly what we want. So one other thing that we could do is in the event pre-construct of our item grid itself, if we plug in the rep box here and we set the horizontal alignment, we can make this a variable and make that instance editable. And we'll call this rep box alignment. We compile that. And then when we go into the hotbar, we can see over here we have the rep box alignment and it's set to fill horizontally, but we can just set this to center horizontally instead. And this will now still be outlined to the center. But if I go into the third person character here and I go into this inventory component and say, actually, I want to have 18 slots. And we open up the player inventory screen itself. So that's this one. And we go to this item grid over here. We can set this one to be aligned to the left instead. Aligning it to the left probably should be the default value. So if you just go back into the item grid real quick, go to this variable, probably set this as default to left aligned, because we probably never want to use fill, to be honest with you. And now we can see this is still aligned in the center. We open the inventory and this is now aligned to the left. So our item grid is now a lot more versatile to use in a bunch of different types of scenarios. And without adding any more code, we can pick up some of the items that we have in here and we can immediately start putting them into our hotbar, because it essentially is just another inventory container and it works the exact same way that it would in a chest, except both of these just exist on the player character. But we don't have anything to select what slot is currently active or selected in our hotbar, and that's kind of an important part of the hotbar, so let's take a look into that next. So in our hotbar widget blueprint, we're going to be adding two more variables, and number one will be our selected index, and that will just be a normal integer. This is going to keep track of the index in the array inside of our rep box of which of our slots is currently selected. Then we're also going to have a reference to our currently selected slot. This is going to be a widget blueprint item slot object reference. So the very first thing that we're going to do is we're going to be making a couple of new functions. Function number one that we're going to be making here will be get current selected slot reference. And this is just a function to do exactly what I just said. So what we're going to be doing is simply just adding a return node. We'll get our item grid. From the item grid, we'll get the rep box. And in that, we'll get child at a certain index. And that index is just going to be our currently selected index. And we're just going to return that child value. Just as easy as that. We'll set this to be a pure function, so that it becomes one of these green nodes that doesn't have execution pins, because there's no execution happening here, it's just getting a value. And then we'll make another new function here, and we'll call that set selected slot. And in that, we're going to be using the get current selected slot reference pure function that we just made, and we'll get the output from that, which will just be a generic widget object. So we'll need to cast that to our WBP item slot. And then we'll set our currently selected slot to that output value. And once we've done that, we will run the set selected function on that, which effectively only does one thing, and that is just change the brush so that it has the outline on it. So now that we have all of that set up in event construct in our widget blueprint hotbar, after we update the item grid initially, we can just set slots that easily. And this will by default, since the selected index will be a value of 0, get the first slot selected. So now if we just play the game, we can see that the first slot will be highlighted because it is selected. The value for this will be referencing that first slot. This index is at 0. Everything is good. Now, next up, what we want to do is we want to make something that can allow us to choose which slot is selected. And we're going to do this in two different ways. We want to be able to do this through our keyboard key. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. But I also want to be able to scroll through like this, right? I'm zooming in and out, but you get that point. Like most games with a hotbar, you can scroll through. So we're going to be able to do both of those. And for those, I'm going to go into my third person here. I'm going to go into input. I'm going to open up my input mapping context because we're going to be adding something to that. And we'll go into the actions here and just make some new ones. So we have in inputs, input actions. This does require you using the enhanced input system, but by this point, like if you're working in a new Unreal project, you're probably already on the enhanced input system. We'll make an input action called Hotbar, and then we'll also make a input action here called input action Hotbar scrolling, or just Hotbar scroll, something like that. And the only thing that's really important to change about these two is we're going to open up Hotbar scroll, and we'll change the value type here from digital bool to being a axis 1D float, because scrolling up and down with your mouse wheel, just like moving it left and right or up and down, will give you a float value that you can then use in order to drive your code with. Otherwise, it's not going to have a float value output. So we're going to do it like that. Then in our input mappings, we'll just add these two mappings, input action for the hotbar and an input action mapping for the hotbar scroll. The hotbar, what we're going to do is we're just going to assign every single number key that we want. So 1, 2, 3, like we have 6 in total. So just 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. We don't need that last one. And we're going to write a little function that takes in this input action and then is going to figure out which actual key we pressed. This is the easiest way to set this up as one input action. Otherwise, you can make separate input actions for every single key if you want to, but this is the beauty of the enhanced input system, allowing you to do it like this. And then for hotbar scroll, we just simply use the mouse wheel axis. So with those mapped, we can go back into our widget blueprint for the hotbar, and we can add those input actions for hotbar and one for the hotbar scroll. And you'll be able to see that because the hotbar scroll is a one-dimensional axis for a float, it has this action value that is actually usable for us. This is just a bool whether or not it is being pressed or unpressed, I suppose. One thing that I should point out is that these input actions only will work if your input mode, like if we get player controller, we have the different input modes, right? So we can set input mode to either game and UI, the game only, or UI only. In order for these input actions to recognize, you do need the input mode to be either game only or game and UI, because these are being picked up by the game itself. The moment you set your input mode to UI only, so maybe if you like open up an inventory screen or whatever, these are not going to fire anymore, which should be fine, because if you're in an inventory anyway, if you have a widget open that is like purely UI interaction based, you probably don't want to be messing with your hotbar anyway. So let's get started with the more annoying one of the two, and that is the input action for the hotbar, because for that, we want to find out what actual key was pressed, and we can make a function for that. In my own testing projects, I just make that in here, but it is actually probably better if you make that in a blueprint function library. So if you go into here, into blueprints, we can make a blueprint function library, and we can call this like BP utils for utilities, and that creates our new function. So we can call this find pressed key. Find pressed key is going to take in an input action. So this will be the input action of type, you would never guess it, but it'll be of type input action. So input action here, the object reference. And then we're going to do some magic stuff with the enhanced input system. So for that, we need to get the player controller first. And this might be a different type of get player controller than you're used to, because it takes in a world context object. Because this is a function library, it doesn't actually exist in the world, so it's going to need to be given that context. Little cut in during the editing here. For the world context object, what you want to do is you want to make that its own input here, because it's going to need to have an object that actually exists in the world to be able to get the player controller. Then when we have that player controller, we can get the enhanced input local player subsystem, which is a reference to a bunch of functions to do with the enhanced input system. And with that, we can query the keys mapped to an input action. So we can get this input action in here, and that will give us an array of keys that are mapped to it. So it'll just give us an array that says 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. If for whatever reason you have like remappable keys, this also then does give those remapped values, which is quite nice. For now though, we're not going to be bothering with that, and we'll just do a for each loop, and we'll hook that up. and that will get us the individual keys. And for each one of those, with our player controller, we're going to check is input key down, and then we'll just hook up the input key in the for each loop to that. So just going to iterate over every single input that could possibly be firing this input event and checking for all of them, is it currently down? If it is currently down, we'll add in a branching node, will return. And when you return in a function, it also ends any like looping. It's just like the end of the function, right? So we don't have to worry about looping through the rest of this because it's not going to. And we'll return a value of whatever array element we were at that time. So this is a nice little function that we can now reuse in other places in our game very easily as well. Put in an input action and it's going to return us the actual key that was pressed to trigger that input action. So with that, let's open up this input action for the hotbar and say find pressed key, just as easily as that. And we're going to do that on started. And once again, I'm cutting in here real quick in the editing phase because I didn't have this word context object in there originally. You can just get a reference to self and put that in there, and that should be all that's required. And then with this array element, we can use this to make a new function. So let's make a function here. Again, we're back in the WBP hotbar. So let's make that function, and that will be our update selected slots. In there, we'll take in the input of the key that was pressed, which will of course be a key, just simply the key structure, nothing else more fancy. And for those, we'll just check if it is equal to all of the potential options. We can hard code this with a bunch of branches, but we can also do this a little bit more cleverly because we can still get the player controller and we'll do something very similar to what we just did a moment ago. So from that, we'll get the enhanced input local player subsystem. We'll query the keys mapped to an action, and the wonderful thing is you don't actually need to have like in your blueprint a reference to it. These input actions, because they're assets, we can just get them from a drop-down menu. So we can just check the input action for hotbar from that, and we can once again just do a for each loop over those, and we can check, hey, is this one equal to the key that has just been registered as being inputted? Because if it is, then we're going to move forward and execute the rest of the code, which the most important bit of which is going to be our currently selected slots. We're going to set that unselected, which again, set unselected really only changes the image. So we'll do that if this branching node is true. And then we'll set our currently selected index to correspond to the array index of the for each loop. And the wonderful thing about this is that because it goes through these in order, it's also going to line up perfectly to your hotbar slots themselves, because hotbar slot 1 is going to have an index of 0, array start at 0, of course, but also the input corresponding to that is also going to be at array index 0, right? This is array index 0, this is 1, this is 2, this is 3, this is 4, this is 5. So we can very easily just use the array index here. And once we've done that, we can simply set our new selected slots. And then with all that, we can update the selected slots to use whatever key we just found was pressed. And now when we go into the game, we can see that we can switch our slots with our 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 keys to whatever we want. So that is one half of selecting the slots. Now the second half will be the scrolling bit, which actually is, believe it or not, a lot simpler. If you have, every time you scroll your mouse in a little bit, it goes in like these steps, right? And if you have like a smooth mouse scroll wheel, you don't notice as much, but it still goes in these steps. And every time you go up or down a step, this will trigger, and the input action value will either just be +1 or -1. Exactly. So even though this is a float, it's going to only be returning integers for this specific action. That just means that we can either increase or decrease our currently selected index by that value. We do need to write a little bit of logic for it to be able to wrap around, but that is really, really easy. So first things first, of course, what we're going to do is we're going to get our currently selected slots, and we're going to set that as unselected, started. Then we'll get our currently selected index and try to see what that is once we add the input action value, which again is going to be either just +1 or -1. So it's going to be selected index +1 or selected index -1. Just to be sure we can then truncate it. Unreal is going to add this note for us otherwise anyway. And here we want to check whether or not it is less than 0 or greater than 5. Why 5? If you don't quite get that, we have 6 inventory slots labeled 0 through 5, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. So if it is greater than 5, it's 6 or above, which doesn't correspond to any of our inventory slots. So if you have 10 inventory slots, you want to check whether or not it's greater than 9. And we can put in branching nodes for both of those. So let's hook both of those up. We first want to check this. If that is false, we're going to be checking this. And if that is also false, then we very simply just set our selected index to be equal to our selected index plus the input action value that we made down here. The truncated version, obviously. Truncate just gets rid of the decimals and makes a float into an integer without any rounding logic. Then next up, if it is greater than 5, or again, depending on how many inventory slots you have, a different value, we're just simply going to set it back to 0. It's going to wrap around to the beginning. And if it is less than 0, so if it goes into the negatives, we want to wrap it around to the end, which again is going to be the same value as this, in our case, 5. And with that, we simply set our selected slots. I told you this was actually a lot easier. This is much more straightforward to set up. And now if we do this, we can also scroll through. I do notice that for me, I'm scrolling down right now and it's going right to left. And when I scroll up, it's going left to right. Depending on what you like, you might want to have this the other way around. I want to have this the other way around for now. So I can go into my input action mappings. I can get the mouse wheel axis. I can add a modifier to it. And we will add a negate modifier, and that just flips positive and negative directions. So now that I've done that, it makes a lot more sense to me. So when I scroll toward me, it's going left to right, and when I scroll away from me, it's going right to left. Now, the very last thing that we want to do is, now that we have all of that stuff set up, we want to be able to use the item in our hotbar. So for that, we're going to go back once again into our input actions here, and I'm going to just make one more, and we're just going to make an input action for use item and add that to our input mappings here. So I'll just make one more input mapping here. This will be for use item, and the mapping for this will be the E key or something like that, whatever we want, right? Logically, we could make this left click, but left click already does other stuff as well, so that might be a little bit confusing. And once again, going back to our WBP hotbar, we can add the input action for use item, which again, do pay attention to the fact that you need to be in input mode, game only or game NUI in order for this to recognize. So you can't use these items from your hotbar while your inventory screen itself is up. We'll get our currently selected slot though. Just for safety, we're going to check whether or not it is valid. It should always be valid, but you never know. And then we're going to get from that the actual inventory slot structure, which we will split. We'll get the item asset out of that. There as well, we're going to check whether or not that is valid. This one actually is important because this is checking whether or not the slot itself has an item in it. If there's no item in it, this is not going to be valid. This is only going to be valid if it has an item inside of it. So then we get the inventory components for the hotbar that we set up earlier in the video. We're going to get the owner from that, and we will just cast that to the BP third person character. You can also just get player character for this. That works just as fine. But I do think it's worth showing that this is a way to do it as well inside of this widget, in case you need to get an owner of something that isn't the player character. And then using the item assets here, we can use the interact blueprint interface that we made in the previous part. And you want to use the message version of this. We can just put in the player that we just cast to. In this case, we do want to remove the item after using. So let's put in a branch, say remove item. We'll get our inventory component here and use the subtract item function that we've made in the past. And we want to subtract from our currently selected slots, get inventory slots. And if we split that open, the inventory slot index. For the most part, it probably should always be the same as the selected index that we have in this blueprint as well. But in case something goes wrong, something is a little wacky, something is a little bit weird, this will always be a lot more consistent because it's actually referring to that object, that actual inventory slot. Now, after we use up an item, it's going to refresh the inventory, which means that it's going to override the actual outlined slot that we have, which is a little bit annoying, but that's just how redrawing the inventory works in our system. So the easiest way to fix that is just to set our selected slots again. I just run that function again, and that will run the set selected, just changing the brush on the corresponding proper inventory slots. And now we can finally test the potion that we made. So let's pick up these potions, which are very big in the world. I'm going to put them in this slots over here. There's one more issue that we're going to need to fix, and that is if you see here, I can hover over these and these become selected, which for the most part is still behavior that you maybe probably do want to have for like player feedback. But then if I cancel out of the inventory slot itself, you can see that it stops highlighting whatever was just highlighted and nothing is highlighted now. We still have a selected inventory slot. If we start scrolling, it'll update, but it's a little bit ugly that it removes the highlighted inventory slot. So what we're going to do in a moment is we're going to use that button, remember when we set up that button, to just run some code to update that whenever we unhover the button or whenever we unselect the button. But for now, we can see we can use this and it uses up one item. We can see the stamina and mana were 50, but our health got upgraded to 60. And then if we use it one more time, our health is now 70. And if we try to use it one more time, of course, we don't have any potions, so that doesn't work anymore. And back in the widget blueprint here, if we just go to our button and we say unhovered, we simply set our selected slot, and you will notice that that's going to make things function a little bit better. So if we pick up these things again, so if I hover over any of these slots, it's going to highlight whatever slot I have my cursor on. But the moment I make my cursor leave the hotbar, it's going to snap back to whatever slot was selected. So I can still select a slot like this, then it's going to highlight them over here. You will note that the slot itself keeps also being highlighted. There's a little bit of an issue where if you hover over it and then unhover over it, the highlighting for it disappears. But the moment I leave this again, it's going to snap back to that. And if I go select this and I close the inventory, you can also see that it snaps back, because that technically counts as being unhovered because we don't have the cursor over the hotbar anymore, because the cursor's nowhere. The cursor doesn't exist anymore. Now, if you really wanted to fix that last little issue, we could also go to the button and say unhovered. We can get our currently selected slots and we can set unselected as well. And I'll change the image of the selected slots the moment we enter this hotbar, as you can see. So now it immediately disappears, so we don't have that issue that we had before with like potentially two things being outlined and being a little bit confusing and a little bit iffy. So this honestly just a visual bug, but it's a visual bug that you probably don't want in your game. So very easy to fix, very easy to set up everything around that, and we have a working hotbar now. And a very big thank you to all of my Patreons. You can see them on screen right now. If you want to help out supporting the channel, there's a link down below in the description to the Patreon page. A huge thank you to my Cave Student tier supporters, Earl Monseval Erno, and my Cave Digger tier supporters, Sir J. Thomas,